The idea that everything comes from Atlantis is a weak idea because it has no solid foundation. Until we actually have a specific Atlantean civilization, then I think we need to look for alternatives. And the same as well about aliens. Now, I mean, aliens is something that I have written a lot about, and but not from the perspective that most people would think. I mean, to me, I believe that humanity, probably since the beginning, I mean, going back hundreds of thousands of years, has possibly been influenced by non-terrestrial intelligences who have affected us mentally as opposed to physically. In other words, ideas could have created new inventions, spurts of advances, and that this has been going on possibly
but not starships landing and entities in flesh and blood walking around.
No. I don't think that it needs any of that.
Where do we come from? How did it all start? How much of what we're told in school about our ancient history is trustworthy, and how much is pure guessing? And how much do we honestly want to find out ourselves? This is Mind the Shift. I am Anders Bolling. My guest today has dedicated most of his life to searching for the truth about who we humans are. It's an honor and a pleasure to meet you, Andrew Collins. Welcome.
Anders, hi. It's my pleasure to be here.
Now, you've written at least a dozen books, or maybe is it 15, or how many is it?
I've lost count. It's about
lost count.
Yeah.
That they all challenge the way we perceive our past, and they also touch on the relationships between our minds and significant structures, relics, artifacts, and pieces of art, as well as the significance of the cosmos in our history, which is really fascinating. And it's something that not most mainstream archaeologists and historians delve into, really, not in that fashion anyway. So how did this all start? I mean, how did this deep private investigation of yours into the origins of humankind begin? What was your drive from the start?
It was certainly a passion for the mysteries of life. Going back to school, when I was, maybe 8 or 10, I was interested in things like ghosts, UFOs, astral projection, what dreams meant. I was getting books out of the library by, Sigmund Freud on dream analysis and stuff like this, books that I couldn't really even understand, to try and get answers to, who we are, where we come from, and what are we doing here. So that sort of was my sort of childhood introduction to it. But then as the years went by, I eventually started writing about a number of mysteries, most of them local to where I lived in southeast England at the time. And I started producing books that sold on, to a local market. But those mysteries started to become more national, if you like, as in to do with the whole of Britain, and then more international as to do with the whole globe. And obviously I started focusing in on certain areas of interest, particularly ancient Egypt, where I've written various books that are very specifically related to, the dynastic history of the place, but also the origins of civilization. And since the mid-1990s, I've been focusing in on the area of southeast Turkey as the cradle of civilization, the place where it all began after the last ice age, and basically saying that something big must have occurred in this area, a meeting between the indigenous peoples there and somebody else that clearly came in, some kind of elite group, maybe of shamans or priests or something, that came in and kick-started a lot of activities to do with art and technology and cosmology that seemed to change everything and that was remembered in myth and legend as stories like the Watchers and the Nephilim of the Book of Enoch, or the Anunnaki of the Sumerian and Babylonian tradition, or even the Immortals of Iranian myth and legend. All of these overlap and interlink with each other, and all of them point to the same area as the foundation point of what we'd call civilization, but the genesis point of human activity. And I said that something must have happened there. Now, I wrote all this in a book called From the Ashes of Angels that was published in 1996. And
you wrote that before the discovery of this very...
And what was so interesting about it is that as I was writing the words to this book, what I didn't realise was that the first spades were going into the ground at Göbekli Tepe, in the very area that I said that you would find something. And Göbekli Tepe didn't really come onto the map as far as the mass media is concerned until the year 2000, which is when I found out about it. I mean, I was already highlighting in my books that particular culture, the so-called pre-pottery Neolithic culture of the region of Anatolia and the Near East. But now we had this smoking gun that showed us that something big had gone on there right at the tail end of the last ice age, at the tail end of this mini ice age that had been tagged on to the end of the big ice age, which we call the Younger Dryas. And what I'd suggested is that the Younger Dryas was involved with some kind of cataclysm, something that involved an object coming out of the sky and devastating parts of the northern hemisphere, and leaving as a legacy some kind of memory of this event that may well have triggered a lot of sudden spurts of human activity, not just in the area of southeast Anatolia, where Göbekli Tepe is placed, but in other parts of the world, and in myths and legends, of course. I mean, there are thousands of myths and legends around the world that talk about some kind of catastrophe that reflected both a element coming from the sky, fire falling out of the sky, but also obviously a humongous flood that covered large areas, destroyed people, and left alive only a few survivors. I mean, obviously, most obvious one being that of Noah and the Great Flood of the Bible. But of course, this is just one of hundreds of similar stories around the world. So that was it, really. And once Göbekli Tepe was on the map, then that became my priority from that point onwards. I was lucky enough to visit it in 2004. This was just after the publication of my book From the Ashes of Angels in Turkey. That came out in 2002, and I was invited to a big festival in Diyarbakir, which is the administrative centre of southeast Turkey today. And whilst I was there, I wasn't really sort of getting paid much for it. So I said, well, look, can you allow me to see some of these sites that I'm going to be talking about? Because I've never been to them. And they said, yeah, sure. We'll give you a car, a driver, and a translator for a week. And I said, thank you very much. And obviously, I was able to visit Göbekli Tepe and various other pre-pottery Neolithic sites, like Chayunu, which is near Diyarbakir, Karahan Tepe, which is now big in the news today. There's excavations going on. So all of these sites I visited in 2004. And the consequences of all of that was a book that came out in 2006 called The Cygnus Mystery. And obviously, as to why it's a mystery and why it's something to do with Cygnus, we may or may not come on to later on in the show.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. You're talking about Göbekli Tepe now, and just for the listeners to understand a little bit more what this is, they might not be aware of this very significant site. We just explain a little bit more closely what it is. It's a site that was discovered by the German archaeologist, what's his name now? Klaus Schmidt. In 1994, and it's in southern Turkey. It's close to the border with Iraq, I think, or Syria, maybe.
Syria.
In that area. and it's a large site. And the most significant thing is that these megalithic structures that are found there are very, very much older than you might expect from what we have been told so far about the history of humankind. And I've just read your magnificent book about it, Göbekli Tepe, The Genesis of the Gods. This magnificent book is really very, very. It's a fantastic book. It's both very personal and also peppered with knowledge and facts. So it's very special. And I just read it, and it's you understand, of course, that this is a place of enormous significance, and the discovery has also big implications for the story of our past. So, if you just in a few sentences or minutes can explain what is it that makes Göbekli Tepe so important?
Well, firstly, the age. I mean, the carbon-14 dating of the various stone enclosures that are these like stone circles, but the stones are shaped like the capital T, basically. They've got these T-shaped terminations. And on most of them, they have carvings, like in relief of animals of all descriptions, everything from boars to bulls to snakes to insects to different types of birds. But many of these stones are also anthropomorphic in the sense that it's very clear that the T-shaped termination actually represents the head of an individual, and you have the appearance actually on the base of the stones, the stems of the stones, of what appears to be claws and arms and hands that have been deliberately carved to emphasize the fact that these are anthropomorphic. But they never have faces. It's like the faces were deliberately left out so that when you look at them, quite clearly you can conjure up any face that you want. And this has led to the suggestion that maybe these T-shaped pillars, of which there are hundreds there, represent maybe the first gods or celestial beings or divine ancestors, great ancestors of the past, which I think all of these are in some way correct. I don't think there's any one answer, and nobody has the exact answer at this point in time. But I mean, the thing that got me when I first looked at Göbekli Tepe and I looked at all the carvings, and having already written extensively about Sumerian civilization, Egyptian civilization, was just how alien, and I don't mean from the stars, but I mean just how alien the carvings looked and so out of place to Southwest Asia. I mean, they looked like nothing that came after them. And if I had to,
and it's what's the time frame here? It's the carbon-14 dating has dated this site.
Yeah, I mean, basically the site was occupied and used between 9,500 BC and 8,000 BC. So that's a period of around 1,500 years. And, it was in full operation. I mean, but what's so interesting is that these huge stone enclosures, which, you could compare, let's say, with Stonehenge, although Stonehenge with beautiful carvings and these T-shaped capitals, is that the most sophisticated, the largest and most sophisticated of the enclosures are the oldest ones. And as the years went by, these enclosures got smaller and smaller and less sophisticated until eventually they went from being, let's say 30 meters across down to about 3 meters across. And they look like, the size of your bathroom or something. I mean, it's bizarre the way that everything changed, but you would expect the sophistication to be going in the opposite direction, that you would get the simplest enclosures to start with and the sophistication would come afterwards. But that's not the case at Göbekli Tepe.
It seems as if people were forgetting the knowledge.
They were forgetting, but also they were getting to the point where they didn't need to do what they were doing anymore. And you might say, well, why would that be? Well, the answer is clear, that the people that created Göbekli Tepe still had a very strong memory of this cataclysm, which is now pretty well established to have occurred initially around 10,800 BC and to involve a fragmentation of a comet that came into the atmosphere and peppered the northern hemisphere, creating huge devastation, possibly destroying up to 75% of the population in North America alone, but also reaching very close to Göbekli Tepe itself. There is a site on the Euphrates called Abu Horoya. It's in modern-day Syria, although today it's beneath the waters of a dam, a reservoir of a dam. And the archaeologists there discovered not only artifacts going back 11 to 12,000 years and more, but they also found a layer of melted glass and other types of what they call scoric debris, which could only have been created by something of extreme high temperature. And we're talking, 2,500 degrees centigrade. Now, the only thing that can cause this on Earth is lightning. But if it's lightning, it's a very small area. But this was over an extensive area, and strongly has suggested to climatologists, to geologists, and many other types of disciplines that we are dealing with some kind of obviously a comet impact, but some kind of airborne blast of fire, which is quite characteristic of what would happen with an incoming fragment of a comet. And this was found all over the Northern Hemisphere. Also, there is a layer of thick black ash that's been found in various continents around the world that all dates to about 10,800 BC. In Europe, it's called the Usilu Horizon. In America, it's called the Black Mat, and it contains cosmic debris of catastrophe, and it's very similar around the world. And it tells us that this catastrophe almost certainly did occur.
And the fact that it's the reason it's black is because there were large fires all across the northern hemisphere.
Yeah, but it's not simply the fires at the location. It's about the fires creating ash and debris that rises up into the air and remains in the lower atmosphere until, of course, clouds form, and then it falls back down with rain generally, which would be very toxic, very acid-like rain that would then not just create this layer, but also stain very heavily the soil around it, which is exactly what's been found. I mean, I've viewed this layer in where was it? Belgium, just over the border from Holland, with the discoverer a few years ago, and it is bizarre because I saw it within these sandy layers, layers which had been laid down at the end of the last ice age, and if you pick it out, it's almost like exactly the same as what you would get if you looked beneath a bonfire in your back garden. It's that same oily blackness. It's very strange to feel that and to know that it's around 12,800 years old, and yet it's still exactly the same as it was then. And that brings to life just how terrible this event must have been across the Northern Hemisphere. But
it is established that the climate changed during this time, isn't it?
Yes, it has. I mean, you've only got to look at the ice cores in the Arctic and Antarctic to be able to see, big changes in the chemicals going on at this time, which tells us that there were huge conflagrations going on in the world. A lot of fires, basically. Now, the skeptics would say, well, these are just regional fires that were going on here and there, or at best maybe some volcanoes that were going up at the time. But I'm afraid to say that the evidence of the glass, the melted glass, for instance, which is everywhere. I mean, it's all over the different continents, would tend to suggest that we are dealing with something that totally devastated the Northern Hemisphere. And so these people at Göbekli Tepe, they come out of this, and immediately this mini ice age, which was almost certainly triggered by this event and lasted 1,200 years. So that brings us to 9,600 BC. That's when Göbekli Tepe was built. So it was built directly after the end of this mini ice age. And, here you have people creating these incredible Stonehenge-like monuments at this time. And you have to ask yourself, what was going on here? Well, firstly, I identify in the book that you've read, Göbekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods, the fact that there is very clear comet imagery on various of the stones, particularly the most important
that's very salient when you
biggest
write
and most important ones. And this alerted me to the fact that the people that were here very clearly were trying to appease or stop any further cataclysms taking place. And to do this, they were employing the services of shamans. And these shamans would enter into what we'd call a death trance, in other words, a very heavy altered state of consciousness, and believe that they were being projected, through certain stones within these monuments towards the sky world, in other words, somewhere that was accessed via the Milky Way, via the stars. And here they would encounter the supernatural creatures that were thought to bring about these cataclysms. Now, what type of supernatural creatures? Well, we're talking about essentially canines, essentially large canines, dogs, wolves, and foxes. And obviously in North America, for instance, it would be coyotes, for instance. Mm-hmm. And all of these are what's known as tricksters. And these tricksters are what can bring about catastrophe. They can bring about the end of the world. They can bring about the end of time. And they have to be appeased. They have to be made offerings. And when a comet appears in a sky, and strangely enough, in some traditions, this even continues to this day, it is seen as the tail of one of these canines. And that these tails of the comet are the tails of these supernatural creatures that enter into our space and have to be dealt with. And I mean, I put an account in the book from the Maya lands of Mexico from the 17th century of a village where a comet appeared in the sky, which was almost certainly Halley's comet, by the way. And the priests came out dressed in animal robes and garbs, particularly with the tails of foxes. And these quite clearly were the animistic forms that were associated with the intelligence that was connected with these supernatural beings that were thought to bring about catastrophe. That by doing rituals, that by making offerings, they could stave off the end of the world until the next time. And I think that these ideas have been going on ever since the end of the last ice age in different parts of the world. And I think that the reason why the most sophisticated enclosures were constructed at the beginning is because this is when there was the most urgency about dealing with this problem. And this is why you have the comet symbols and imagery on the stones. And this gradually disappears across the centuries until right at the end of Göbekli Tepe, as I say, they were only creating these tiny enclosures that were very simple. Yes, they were still doing the T-shaped pillars, but they were tiny now. I mean, they were now no more than around 2 meters in height. So
people felt that they had been able to appease.
They'd done it, creatures. But the thing is that the world was changing, because about 8,500 BC, there was the introduction of agriculture and animal husbandry, and a lot of other changes in technology that were beginning to occur, so that the interests began to turn away from dealing with things in the sky world to ensuring that the sun appeared each day, and obviously, at the time of the winter solstice, for instance, that it would start, the days would start growing longer, etc., because this now became more important to them because of their settled lifestyle. It was now important to them to basically revere and venerate the sun. I mean, literally. And for this reason, we see the changes in the orientation of the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe suddenly changing from what are quite clearly picking out certain stars to picking out where the sun either rises or sets on the horizon at the time of the solstices and the equinoxes. And I think that's really important to stress that, you know, that the emphasis of the orientation of these enclosures suddenly changed. Okay. And this reflects what was going on in the world at the time, and that's what we call the Neolithic Revolution, and the beginning of agriculture.
Yeah. But the earliest enclosures at Göbekli Tepe are really advanced. I mean, for the time, they how could something that advanced have been created more than 5,000 years before we have been told that civilization was even beginning in Sumeria and Egypt and whatever we are told in school?
Well, the answer to that is that quite clearly a lot of these technologies already existed, and must have been carried through the final part of the Ice Age. Although clearly they weren't there in southeast Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. They must have come from somewhere else. Now, there are certain influences coming up from the area of the Levant, and the culture that was very dominant there. But, you know, it seems as if that something new was happening in southeast Turkey. And my best guess, and this was also the suggestion of Klaus Schmidt, the discoverer of Göbekli Tepe, and some of his colleagues, is that you're looking at peoples coming down from the area of the Russian steppes and north of the Black Sea, over or around the Caucasus Mountains, and then entering Anatolia from the north, and settling there, probably even before the time of Göbekli Tepe, maybe, I'm going to say around 10,000 BC, maybe 10,500 BC. So at the time when this mini ice age was still taking place, and quite clearly people were escaping it in a way by moving south and trying to find warmer climes. And that's exactly what they did. So they end up in Anatolia. And I think what happened is that you had this very smart, clever elite coming into southeast Anatolia, and there were the local people there, and somehow they convinced the local people that they had the answer of how to make all this stop, how to ensure that these cataclysms never occurred again, and that this involved the creation of these huge enclosures, the earliest stone enclosures of this type anywhere in the world, certainly that we, you know, can officially say go back to that age. I mean, obviously there's other possible candidates, but Göbekli Tepe is the oldest established temple complex in the world.
Well, these are called this group that you're referring to are called the Swederians, if I remember.
Yeah. I mean, Swederians is what we call a techno complex. I mean, and that describes the style of manufacture of their stone tools, which is important because they develop certain styles which become almost like signatures of their culture, and where exactly they managed to end up in Europe. I mean, for instance, the Swederians were as far west as the Carpathians and in Poland, but they were also as far east as the Ural Mountains, which obviously border Asia, and in particular, obviously, Western Siberia beyond it, and as far south as the Caucasus Mountains. And if you look at a lot of the stone tools that have been found at Göbekli Tepe, they very closely match those of the Swederians. And I mean, you can't say that the Swederians were a particular, population or what they looked like or anything like that, because you're dealing with, a style of technology more than an actual culture. But it does give us a clue of who might have been turning up at Göbekli Tepe around 9,600 BC. And it was incoming peoples from the Russian steppes who already had a huge amount of technology, which can be seen from the areas of, let's say, the Ural Mountains, which is where the Swederians were supposed to have begun their own journey, as a carrier culture, carrying those ideas, not just in the creation of stone tools, but the spread of art, the spread of certain technologies, and obviously their arrival in places like Anatolia. You can see it there. You can see the same comparison with the art style, with the stone tools and everything at Göbekli Tepe, with what was going on almost contemporary at sites in the Ural Mountains. Okay. Now, those Ural Mountain sites were themselves a product of migrations from even further east in Siberia and possibly even in Mongolia, in Inner Asia. And you've got this movement of people and ideas gradually going westwards at a much earlier date, because we've got the Neolithic Revolution occurring around, let's say, 8 to 9,000 BC. But this was just the latest phase. Much earlier, you had something else going on in the area of Siberia around 30 to 40,000 years that was gradually moving like waves of activity westwards into Europe, southwestwards into Southwest Asia.
Talking about the Denisovans?
Yes, but not just the Denisovans. That obviously we're talking about hybrid peoples that would have been Denisovans, Neanderthal, and early modern humans. But also, this wasn't just westwards. I mean, quite clearly, what was going on in Siberia was also going eastwards as well, into China, into that sort of eastern Siberia, the areas of the Beringia, the land bridge, and almost certainly going into the Americas. It was going into Southeast Asia. It was spreading out, and of course into South Asia, into India and Pakistan. Those areas as well. So this is, if you want to look for the origins of it all, yes, I suspect that you've got to be looking in the area of Siberia. Now, what was going on in Siberia then? Well, as you've already alluded to, there were a people there called the Denisovans. That is the correct pronunciation, by the way.
Okay, sorry.
And no, honestly, it's like tomato, I'm afraid.
Okay.
But it originally was Denisovan. And the Denisovans we didn't even know existed until the year 2010, when human remains that were found at this place called the Denisova Cave in Siberia, in the Altai Mountains, were analysed, and they were expected to be those of modern humans. They dated to about 45,000 years ago, some even earlier. But when the results came in, the genome was analysed. It was found that we were dealing with a type of human that we'd never come across before. And they started to call them Denisovans. But what they found is that certain of the genes that were present in the Denisovan genome were found in populations all over the world, which clearly showed that the Denisovans had interbred with the earliest ancestors of our own, anatomic modern humans. And so these people were very, very important to the development of human technology, to human cosmology, to human migrations, in art as well, obviously. And so suddenly there was something else going on here we didn't know anything about. And from 2010 right the way through to today, what's gradually been going on is that people are beginning to become aware that a lot of our early developments in art and technology were not our own, that we inherited them and were probably taught them by our Denisovan and also Neanderthal ancestors, because obviously, a large percentage of the populations of the Eurasian continent, for instance, have either Neanderthal DNA, anything up to 2 to 3%, Or on the east side of the Eurasian continent, they have Denisovan DNA, anything up to 5 to 6%. You know, and obviously there's certain crossovers with certain populations. But the importance about the Denisovans is what has been discovered at their primary site, which is the Denisova Cave. I mean, for instance, you know, let your viewers look up the Denisovan bracelet, for instance. Google that in, and you'll see this incredible bangle that was worn on the arm of an individual, they think probably a lady. And it's got a hole pierced through it where you would have had like a cord and something else, maybe a disc of stone hanging from that. And the actual drilled hole is so sophisticated that it looks as if it was done by a modern day drill. You know, in other words, very fast. And of course, what this doesn't mean is that they had electric drills. It's nothing to do with that. But somehow they worked out how to pierce holes in rock at a very fast rate. So that just for the word go shows how sophisticated they were. But that's just the beginning.
Yeah, because I read about that. I recognize the
I mean, this is just the beginning of their technology. I mean, you know, they created the earliest bone needles in the world, which obviously they used to create tailored clothing. They created the earliest musical instrument in the form of a whistle or a flute. They don't know why it's broken. That was found in the Denisova layer the Denisovan layer of this cave. They created a beautiful statuette of a mountain or a cave lion that has markings on it that would suggest an understanding of the cycles of the sun and the moon. I've talked about this before, and I'll be talking about again in a new book coming out, that tends to suggest that the minds of the Denisovans were very meticulous relating to cycles and numbers and intricacies, which I don't think a lot of anatomical modern humans had at the same time. And what happened, of course, is that our modern human ancestors interbred with these Denisovans. We don't know how, just in the same way that we must have interbred with the Neanderthals. And the hybrid descendants of these inherited this legacy, and they were the ones that started to carry it into different parts of the Eurasian continent, but also, of course, into the Americas as well.
Over to America as well.
Yeah.
So it all started in Siberia.
Yeah,
maybe.
Yeah. I mean,
I'm a bit confused though when it comes to the time frame here and the ice age, because this must have gone on during the latest ice age, as far as I understand.
Absolutely.
And I mean, Siberia was covered with ice, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. And the interesting thing is that one of the genes, it may even be two, but one of the genes of the Denisovans that was found in the Inuit peoples of Greenland is one about bulking up. In fact, it's two genes. It's two specific genes about bulking up so that you can withstand extremely cold environments. And what becomes clear is that the peoples of Greenland, the Inuits that had clearly come over, probably from the American continent, from Canada, had inherited this gene from their own ancestors who must have interbred with Denisovans. And this enables them, even to this day, to live in extremely cold environments. And this was developed by the Denisovans over probably tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years. And we now know, for instance, that the Denisovans had been around the area of Siberia and also Tibet. This is the important thing, Tibet. We now know they were in Tibet for at least 200, maybe even 300,000 years. And I mean, and the other important thing is that the technology that eventually ends up being carried by the Swederian peoples into Anatolia and southeast Turkey was developed, it would now seem, by the last of the Denisovans and handed to their hybrid descendants probably in the area of Mongolia. This is what the latest archaeological evidence is showing, probably around 30 to 35,000 years ago. And that once we had been given this particular type of stone tool technology, we carried it, we went with it and used it throughout the whole of the so-called Upper Paleolithic period from about 45,000 years ago, right the way through into the Neolithic. And it's found there at Göbekli Tepe. And it's almost like a paper trail that begins in time around 30 to 35,000 years ago and ends, if you like, at Göbekli Tepe around 11,500 years ago. So in other words, the sophistication, the technology and the art which comes from the mindset of the people that created Göbekli Tepe comes originally, I would say, and I would put my money on this, from the area of Siberia, Mongolia, and that it came westwards via the Ural Mountains into Europe and Southwest Asia.
Okay, fascinating. Well, we'll see if you get your money back then. When more discoveries are made.
There's a new book coming out by a professor of history at Oxford by the name of, I'll have to look it up. Hyam. Coming out on March the 25th. That's just a few days' time. And it's essentially saying exactly what I've just been telling you. Okay. And cool. I say this because I have been talking about this in my books for the last 5 or so years. And eventually the ideas of mavericks like myself, and my background is journalism. I have no qualifications whatsoever. I left school at 16. Eventually the academics and the scholars come around to your way of thinking, often than not. And you'll never get any credit for it, not one word of credit, but that's life, I'm afraid.
Yeah. It's always the mavericks who push the envelope.
They do, and the academics and the scholars will read your books, but they'll never admit to it, ever. Yeah. They can't, because, their positions, their seats in universities, the grants that they get would all just disappear, evaporate away. And so I understand it. And I don't care, because, if I'm proved right, eventually I can just highlight that and say, well, look, if you want to read where it was originally said, here are my books. And here is the books of other people, other contemporaries of me, like Graham Hancock, who have also said similar things.
Yes, I was going to mention him here, actually, in one of my questions. But let's go back to Göbekli Tepe and the Swederians, or whatever we should call that group of people who came down there with this knowledge and this technology, who helped these people that were there in southern eastern Anatolia build these megalithic structures. Why hadn't they built these megalithic structures before in other areas where they were living before? Why did they do this just when they arrived there? What happened? I mean, to me, it's a bit difficult to understand why this all of a sudden just became these magnificent builders of megalithic structures.
Well, I'll tell you a story. Some of the legends relating to the idea of a conflagration, fire falling from the sky, coupled with a flood, all have a similar ending. And that ending goes that there are only a couple of survivors, maybe one family that were either in that were protected in a cave, on a mountain, or on a boat or something. You know the way that it goes. And it said that when they come out, the first thing they do is build an altar to give thanks to their God that they are still alive and that this will never happen again.
Yeah.
That is a idealistic view of the creation of places like Göbekli Tepe. These structures were built out of a necessity to ensure that this type of what has been described as catastrophobia, the fear of of a catastrophe taking place, will never happen again. And you're going to do whatever it takes. And if these weird priests or shamans come up to you and say, look, we know how to sort this out, but to do it, we're going to have to create these monuments which act as almost like stargates, if you like, between this world and the next. This will ensure that we can get and deal with the supernatural creatures that cause these problems in the world. We can do it instantly, but you've got to help us. Talking to the local people of Anatolia, you can help us. You can do this. Are you up for this? Yeah, let's do it. And that's how these enclosures were created, because it's quite clear that there was a hierarchy involved. There must have been many settlements involved in the construction of Göbekli Tepe, covering a vast area around it. And these occupational mounds, many of them have yet to be even investigated. Yeah. And this is where the people lived. Nobody lived at Göbekli Tepe. No evidence has ever been found. This is a ritual ceremonial site, a place where you would do things, basically do things of a magical level, on a magical nature, involving the entering of altered states of consciousness and projecting yourself outwards into the sky world, into the cosmological realms. Yeah. And I mean, we talked about my book, The Cygnus Mystery. Well, one of the reasons why it's called The Cygnus Mystery is that after very careful analysis, I concluded that the orientations of the axis of the oldest and largest of the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe all pointed towards the north-northwest. Not the south-southeast, but the north-northwest, and that they focused on the descent of a particular star in the constellation of Cygnus. Now, Cygnus means
the swan.
Yeah, but that particular constellation is also known in Christian tradition as the Northern Cross, and it's very prominently placed on the Milky Way, where the Milky Way splits in two in the north. And this split into two separate arms of the Milky Way is known as the Dark Rift or the Great Rift. And it has been seen by cultures all the way across the Northern Hemisphere as the point of entry into the sky world. It's almost like a road that takes you up and allows you that entrance, so that if you could synchronize that entrance with the horizon, and then project yourself and synchronize your enclosure with that would allow you that access. And there is a particular stone at Göbekli Tepe, which is officially called Pillar 43, but it's unofficially known as the Vulture Stone. And its main image, as the name suggests, is this huge, great vulture. And there are various other figures around it, including a scorpion. And the best solution as to what's going on here is that this is a sky map into the sky world. And that vulture represents the constellation of Cygnus, which was seen as a vulture in the Near East, in Greece, and also in Armenia, which neighbours on to Anatolia, where it's still, to this day, a major constellation. And so what you've got here is quite literally a sky map that was probably used for teaching, initiates of shamans, like, this is where we're going to go. This is the sky map. So when you go here, you've got to jump to there. And this is what that stone was used for. I mean, obviously some of my colleagues have got other ideas, but that's up to them.
Yeah. Talking about colleagues, you're not the only independent researcher that out there that conveys this alternative story about our origins. We mentioned Graham Hancock, whom I think you know, and who wrote the foreword to this book. Yes, and he's also really, really interesting to listen to. And if we take, and there's another person I know a little bit about a few of you. I think there are more out there who are doing this kind of work. But another one is Michael Tellinger, who has also been on the show actually. So if we take Michael Tellinger, Graham Hancock, and yourself, of these three writers, I would say that Tellinger is the most far out, if you should put it that way, because he has a conviction that the legendary Anunnaki from the Sumerian tradition and Babylonian tradition actually were extraterrestrial beings who arrived, contributed to the emergence of Homo sapiens. And then Hancock, of course, he doesn't put ETs into the equation, but he thinks that advanced people, possibly from the legendary destroyed civilization of Atlantis, arrived to help build these megalithic structures all around the Middle East that we don't understand why they were built today. And you seem, among these three, you seem to be the most conservative. Would you agree?
Yes, yeah. I mean, obviously, both Michael and Graham Hancock are friends of mine. I've stayed in both of their houses.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, we have crossovers in our understanding of the past and obviously our differences, but that doesn't really matter because I think we're all adding to a huge pool of knowledge, which is, you know, increasing every year. But I mean, yeah, I mean, I suppose I am the most conservative in a way. I mean, I don't look towards extraterrestrials, and I mean, we're talking about flesh and blood aliens as coming down here and, you know, teaching us the technologies of how to build pyramids and whatever. I'm not really into that. I'm also not really into the idea that survivors of Atlantis, you know, came ashore and, you know, taught the peoples of Egypt or Sumeria or whatever how to build architecture, etc. Because the archaeological evidence just does not pan out, in my opinion. And also, if you're talking about Atlantis, you have to say, well, which Atlantis are you talking about? I mean, there are so many different theories, and even the top researchers in the business seem to chop and change their mind as to where Atlantis is. At some point, it's in Antarctica. You know, the next it's in Indonesia, and the next it's in, you know,
that's Lemuria, I guess.
I mean, you know, and I'm not putting this down. I'm just saying that I think that
I know there are lots of theories.
Atlantis, the idea that everything comes from Atlantis is a weak idea because it has no solid foundation until we actually have a specific Atlantean civilization. Then I think we need to look for alternatives, and the same as well about aliens. Now, I mean, aliens is something that I have written a lot about, and but not from the perspective that most people would think. I mean, to me, I believe that humanity, probably since the beginning, I mean, going back hundreds of thousands of years, has possibly been influenced by non-terrestrial intelligences who have affected us mentally as opposed to physically. In other words, ideas could have created new inventions, spurts of advances, and that this has been going on possibly
but not starships landing and entities in flesh and blood walking around.
No. I don't think that it needs any of that. I mean, look, at the end of the day, the closest star is something like 4 light years away, let's say, 3 or 4. I mean, that's a huge distance to cover, and unless you have, you know, access to stargates and stuff like this, you know, or portals, dimensional portals, or whatever. Which I'm not saying don't exist. I'm just saying that we need a lot more evidence to say that they do. For entities, beings from these other star systems to come down here and influence us physically, what would be far more easier is for them to influence us from a distance, from their own planets in their own star systems, and they can do that by a process called quantum entanglement. Quantum entanglement is the idea that particles essentially can split and become 2 separate particles, but no matter how far away they get, they still communicate with each other instantaneously, or at the same instant of time. I've got to be careful with my wording.
I've heard you talk about time, that time doesn't exist and that we can access the future.
I mean, look, I've been in discussions with one of the top experts in the world on entanglement recently, and he's been trying to sort of put me right on a few things, and I agree with some things, but not with others. But I still stick with the fact that we're dealing with an instant transfer of information, which, although we're dealing with just one particle, there are countless particles everywhere in everything that we deal with, whether it be in the first, second, third state of matter, solid, liquids or gas, but beyond that, even in the full state of matter, which is plasma. And plasma, I think, is the key to understanding the nature of intelligences that have been affecting us for, not just tens of thousands of years, but hundreds of thousands of years. This is something that myself and Greg Little talk about in a new book that we've got coming out next March, which I don't want to say too much about now because not even the title has been settled on yet. But we'll be going into all of these, looking for the origins. This is what we're trying to do.
Fascinating, because that's I'm really happy that you're going that in that direction, because I mean, if we go very far back, we have been talking about the Younger Dryas and the later stages of the latest ice age. But when you look into these things, you kind of, when I read your book, for instance, and even if you go further back, you get the impression that 1,000 years here or there doesn't really matter. And I realized that I came to think of the life of Jesus Christ as being practically in my own time. So, I mean, everything is relative. Jesus Christ, that's just 2,000 years ago. I mean, how many, is it 70 generations or something? So if we go way back, how do you think it all began? Because, well, you say you don't think that there were any extraterrestrial beings in the flesh and blood walking around here, but in some way there might have been some kind of interference, some kind of, may have affected us in some way, because there is something a bit strange, a bit odd about the sudden development, sudden evolution of Homo sapiens or humankind, or however you want to frame it, because there was something that happened maybe 200, 300 or 400,000 years ago that's a bit difficult to explain, really, why we became this species with this much intelligence and this much development of culture and this strange way of living on this planet without having any obvious purpose, which is very, very different from all other animals and all these apes, the other human apes, as they call them, that haven't changed in 2 million years. And, well, you see where I'm going with this.
I can, yeah. I mean, in the next book,
you're going to explain everything.
Well, half of it at least.
Okay.
Because we're going back and focusing on an era of around 400,000 years ago in Israel, a place called the Kazam Cave, which is, incredible discoveries been coming out of there recently, to do with, innovative inventions of humanity that all begin there for the first time. But the important thing about this is that not only did these people, who would seem to have been, early or proto-modern humans, they were not Denisovans, they were not Neanderthals, they would seem to be proto-forms of ourselves, were not only the most sophisticated people on the planet that we know of so far from that age, but they also invented shamanism. Mm-hmm. So they were using, it would seem, the cloaks or feathers to do with swans, which obviously a bird which I've done an awful lot of work on with the Cygnus Mystery, Cygnus Key, and they were clearly using these to enter into altered states of consciousness and to journey into otherworldly environments, taking the form of a swan or being accompanied by a swan acting as some kind of guide into the other world. And there has to be a connection between this invention of shamanism, the communications that would have taken place between these shamans and these otherworldly beings that they encounter, and the fact that suddenly this same community develops some of the most extraordinary inventions for hundreds of thousands of years. And that's something which is the premise of the new book, which will, take it from that point through to the Denisovans, through to Göbekli Tepe, but also try and understand what the intelligences are behind this. And we not only looking at, the ideas of this being something that comes in mentally or through altered states of consciousness, but also the fact that you may be dealing with parallel dimensions, entities that exist normally in a multi-dimensional environment. We call them n-beings, n-dimensional beings. But also looking, and this is why Greg's involved with the book, because he is one of North America's top experts on mound building cultures and their cosmology, and looking at the absolute ultimate beliefs of Native American peoples. What did the Native American peoples truly believe? And it actually is incredibly consistent from, let's say, Canada all the way down to California and beyond. It's extraordinary, and it gives a very good insight into what we should be looking for as answers on the Eurasian continent. Places like Göbekli Tepe, places like Israel and the Levant, and of course, obviously, the Denisovans. And the Denisovans come into this because there is tentative evidence to suggest that the Denisovans, when they originally came out of Africa, probably around 450,000 years ago, encountered the Kazam people, probably mated with them, and that a hybrid of both the Denisovans and these people continued on the journey into the likes of Siberia, Tibet, Mongolia. So, in other words, the Denisovans, by the time that they reached there, were hybrids in themselves.
Right there before the Ice Age, then.
Oh God, yeah. This is, as I said, we're talking
long
here
before
now,
the Ice Age.
400,000 years ago. That's how far away. And of course, that makes Göbekli Tepe look like yesterday.
Yes,
now,
yes, yeah.
So you can begin to understand that by the time we get to Göbekli Tepe, the sophistication, the innovations of humanity has been going for nearly 400,000 years. There's plenty of time to develop things. You don't need aliens. You don't need Atlantis. You don't need them.
No, I understand what you're saying, and it's really fascinating. And these time boundaries, they're being pushed all the time because, I was taught that humankind, Homo sapiens, walked out of Africa in like 70,000 years ago, and then it's been pushed back until 200,000 years ago, 300,000. You're talking about 450,000 years ago.
Yeah.
But you do think that Africa was the cradle still? Or?
I do, absolutely. Yeah. Obviously, some of my colleagues, anthropologists, obviously believe that there was a genesis of anatomical modern humans in Eastern Asia. And that may be correct. I don't know. That may be correct. But certainly the main push, I think, did begin in Africa. And I tried to explain. I take the story back from the Levant, from modern-day Israel, going back into Africa, and try to look at, if we've got these answers for the Levant, if we've got these answers for the Denisovans in Siberia, can we take it back still further? Can we take it back to the origins of the Homo species? And that's something which I look at tentatively in the new book, but it's something that I want to explore more closely in the future. When the world opens up again, I need to get to Africa and do some studies there, which will give me not just answers. I've got the answers. The answers are not the problem, but to back up everything with the exact evidence that we need to be able to take this even onto the next stage.
Yeah. One of the most fascinating things about your research is that you take myths, legends, and ancient texts seriously. You make a practical interpretation of what's written there, these stories.
Yeah.
And you assume that they tell something that has actually happened. Maybe they tell the ones that you're referring to in the book about Göbekli Tepe, maybe they are actually talking about something that took place 200, 300,000 years before what you are assuming in the book. Maybe they are talking about something entirely older, much older things.
Yeah. But I mean, almost certainly the answer is yes. The problem is that you can't see things in terms of a linear timeline that goes back, let's say, from Göbekli Tepe to the Levant 400,000 years ago. You can't see that. You can't see a long line of activity. From, let's say, Göbekli Tepe, it's just like a blur of activity that has no timing connected with it. Mm-hmm. In other words, it becomes almost impossible to define exactly what part of a legend developed for the first time. You have to see it as one complete package and try and interpret it. But you're right. I mean, some elements of those legends could go back,
but the elements about the cataclysm, of course, should refer to that probable comet.
But I mean, obviously, the comet has a specific date, and that date is 10,800 BC. And the knock-on effects of it lasted for hundreds of years, plus a mini ice age that lasted 1,200 years. So, it wasn't just something that happened all in one day. But that's just one. I mean, there almost certainly were other cataclysms that occurred possibly around 30, 40,000 years ago, possibly much earlier. I mean, I don't want to speculate on specific dates because I've not gone into them in huge detail. But clearly this wouldn't have been something on its own. I mean, there would have been other cataclysms, not necessarily to do with a comet. I mean, maybe to do with supernovas, obviously, stratovolcanoes going up. Obviously you got the Toba event, which which took place in, where was Toba? I can't remember now. In Eastern Asia, was it? That affects large parts of Central and Eastern Asia about 70,000 years ago, I think. The Toba event, and possibly created a bottleneck in human advancement where we went down to just a few thousand people. I mean, that's what some of the theories suggest. And that wasn't a cosmic event. That was simply a volcano blowing up, basically. So there's got to be a number of these cataclysms. And I mean, going back to what Plato says just before he really introduces the whole story of Atlantis, which, by the way, I don't dismiss. I mean, I've written a whole book called Gateway to Atlantis that looks at every single one of the theories and eventually pins down the most probable location as the area of the Caribbean and the Bahamas, obviously in the western Atlantic basin.
That's also where Graham Hancock have been diving to look for.
Yes, he has. Yeah, I mean, but obviously Graham has a number of different views about Atlantis. I mean, in his books he has tended to place it in different locations, but most importantly is that he has dived onto these sites all around the world. He did a book called Underworld, which looked at all these remains underwater everywhere. And I think that's really important to say that, look, it's not just Atlantis. We're not just dealing with one location somewhere. There is evidence of lost civilizations off the coasts of many different continents. And that we need to factor that into our understanding of the origins of civilization.
Yeah, I guess anything is possible. Why are we told in school that all these myths and legends and descriptions of mystical events are just fantasies?
Because history books are supposed to be like the be-all or end-all of what happened in the past. But as we know, most history books are only written by the victors, and do not necessarily give us a good assessment of what happened in the past. But the thing about myths and legends is that they're colloquial. They are carried forward by individuals that will have retained that knowledge across countless generations. I mean, I still find it beneficial today to go to a location, whether it be in Turkey, in Egypt, or Indonesia. I was doing it recently, and just say to the village elders, what do you know about this place? What was handed down to you about what was going on. And often they will tell you the most incredible things. And you think, why isn't this in any books?
Yeah.
And the academic will come along and say, oh, this is just
Fairy
local
tale.
rubbish that's been made up to account for why that it's there. Some of it may be, but within it are cores of information that actually make a lot of sense if you check them out. To me, that's very, very important. And is missed by the academics and scholars who will ignore these local people, will ignore the indigenous peoples and just excavate a site, come up to their own conclusions and disappear, and that's the end of it. They won't even interact with the locals. And that I think is wrong.
It's unscientifical, actually.
Well, they would say the opposite, that it's unscientific to listen to folklore and legends. But I think that that's silly. And I'll give you one example. And I haven't got the full facts here, but this, just take my word for this. There is a crater in Australia that was unquestionably the result of a cosmic event. Let's say an asteroid or comet fragment, and I think it dates to about 15,000 years ago. And when the local original peoples were asked about this, originally they said fire came out of the sky and hit the ground and created that. Now, this event took place, let's say, 15,000 years ago. To me, that is a local memory of an event that's been carried forward. And I mean, clearly they didn't just say it that easy. I mean, they had a whole story surrounding, who did it and why. But the core of that information has been preserved across 15,000 years. Yeah. And similar cores of information can be found in folklore, myths and legends all the way around the world. And as you say, I've used it in various of my books, and I'm proud of it. I'm happy to do that. I think that it's very important to listen to what local people have got to say about the sites. If we didn't do that, for instance, Heinrich Schliemann would never have found Troy in southwest Turkey.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, there are so many things to talk about, but time flies. And just finally, I want to ask you, because your book doesn't mention the book that I read, one of the 15 books that you've written, doesn't mention Egypt very much. And
no.
You have written books about Egypt.
Oh, yes.
And it doesn't even appear in the timeline that you provide at the end of the book, as far as I can see.
No. I mean, I think
I was a bit, intrigued there. Why is that? Is Egypt not as important?
It's too much information. I mean, Göbekli Tepe is just such a big subject that it needed a book on its own. And if you started to factor in Egypt as well, it would just been too much. I mean, so all of that is left to the book that follows that, which is called the Cygnus Key. I have to get this right. Now, there's a reason for this, the fact that there's two Cygnus books, and that is quite simply is the fact that I did a first Cygnus Mystery book. It's out of print. The publishers will not give me the rights back. So I thought, well, hell to them. I'll just write the book again under a slightly different name. So I called it the Cygnus Key. But actually, the Cygnus Key turned out to be a completely different book, which has almost got nothing to do with the first one. But it does involve, obviously the Cygnus constellation. It does involve Göbekli Tepe. And what it does show, and this is very, very important, I think, and answers your query here, is that it shows that the people of Göbekli Tepe, at the end of their time there, moved southwards, as well as anywhere else, and ended up in Egypt at a place called Helwan. And that this became their base for thousands of years until eventually that culture created the Pyramid Age. So in other words, the cosmology, the technology, the art that eventually goes into the creation of the Great Pyramid came originally from Göbekli Tepe. And before that, almost certainly as far east as Siberia.
Yeah. So you don't adhere to the theories that the pyramids or the Sphinx in particular were actually built a lot earlier than what is normally.
No, not certainly not the Great Pyramid and the pyramids. I mean, there is too much of a continuity of construction from the earliest mastaba tombs of Egypt through to the creation of the step pyramid, to finally creating the beautiful, perfect pyramids that we see, that of which the pinnacle is the Great Pyramid itself. But I do believe that the technology came from a much earlier age and was present in Egypt as early as 10,500 BC. The Sphinx is an interesting one. I don't believe that any researcher, any writer has the exact information as to its age. Not one. I would challenge any that say that they do. All you can say is that I think that it is older than probably the Great Pyramid, and there's a reason for that, because my personal belief is that the second pyramid was started, not finished, started before the Great Pyramid. Now, I give reasoning for this, good reasoning for this, in the book Cygnus Key, but how old, we don't know. It could just be a couple of 100 years old. It may be older, who knows? I mean, it may be a product, but what I can say is that as a natural feature, a simulacra, the Sphinx is many, many, many thousands of years older than the Pyramid Age, and was revered by the Neolithic peoples of the area from, certainly 3,500 BC, and arguably much earlier still. I have no problems with that. And that was the original Sphinx. But that was a natural monument that looked probably like a lion head with a body that would have been naturally there, sticking out of the ground at Giza. And people would have revered that, just as they revere similar rock outcrops in many parts of the world. In Australia, for instance, the original peoples do. In Africa, many different tribal peoples venerate, outstanding rock features, whatever. We know that. And that's the original Sphinx. And I think that it was the Sphinx that drew people to that location, and the fact that the area was the entrance into a cave system that subsequently became the entrance to what is known in Egyptian myth as the Duat, the Underworld, a cave like Underworld relating to the passage of the soul in death and the path of the sun from sunset through the night to its rising again on the eastern horizon at dawn. And that these were going on at Giza, for many thousands of years before the Great Pyramid was constructed. So in other words, I don't think that everything just suddenly arose around 2500 BC on the Giza Plateau, but I do believe that it was something that began very humbly at a much earlier age and then gradually grew into what we see today on the Giza Plateau.
How they built it is still an enigma in my view, but
yeah, I've tried to tackle that in one of my books called Gods of Eden, and I'll be honest, I only put it in there because the publishers asked for it. They said, could you make sure that you have a whole section on how they actually built the Great Pyramid? Said, well, it's not really my area. So, put it in there anyway, and so it's in there. It's in my book Gods of Eden. So
why not go esoteric and talk about sound frequencies and things like that?
Well, that's exactly what I talk about in there. I mean, I go into detail in Gods of Eden about all of the different traditions around the world of sound technology and the idea of using some kind of musical tones to lift blocks. You can find it in Egypt, you can find it in the Levant, you find it in Mexico. Where else is it? Tibet. It's there in Tibet, various cases. There's something in sound technology. I do honestly believe that, but unfortunately it is definitely a lost technology, I'm afraid. And I think that we're beginning to understand it again, but at the moment we can only raise something about the size of a pea into the air, but I'm sure that pea will get larger in the future.
We should say in this context that an entire cave system beneath the Giza Plateau has its name from you. It's called. That's the system that you were referring to.
That's
the cave
right.
system.
Yeah.
Okay. Collins Caves.
Yeah. Collins Cave, yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, I mean, this is named by Zoe Hawass.
You discovered those?
Yes, yeah. Well, but I think the word discovered is inappropriate. Rediscovered is
rediscovered, of course,
the correct term. And this was myself and a colleague, an Egyptological researcher by the name of Nigel Skinner Simpson. And this was the end product of a 5-year study into looking for the entrance of a lost cave system at Giza. And it really is an Indiana Jones adventure.
Yeah, it sounds
it's
like
written
it.
up in my book, Gateway to Atlantis. No, sorry, wrong book. Beneath the Pyramids. Beneath the Pyramids. You can't get it. It's out of print, but it will be republished one day. And yeah, I mean, it caused an international incident almost. When the authorities finally found out what had been going on, and the fact that I'd written a book about it, I became a persona non grata in Egypt and could have been arrested.
Really?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it was all over the Arabian press at the time, and it was.
And when was this?
Out.
In the 90s or in the 2000s?
Well, the case was discovered in 2008. The book came out in 2009. And I mean, but luckily we did everything right. As soon as we found them, we went to the director of excavations on the plateau at Giza and told him specifically what we discovered and asked him to help us to go back and to see what else we could find. And initially he was interested. Then he just disappeared into the night. At the right time, we also went to Zahi Hawass, who was at the time the director of the Supreme Council of Antiquities, and presented all of our evidence to him, including a paper which remains unpublished to this day. So we did all the right things, and that saved me from getting arrested and put in prison if ever I stepped foot in Egypt again. And the person that smoothed out all of that for me was Robert Bouval, the author of the Orion Mystery, who's a very good friend of mine. And he knew the right people, so he was able to smooth it out. But that didn't stop me getting banned from Turkey, which happened a year or so ago. The book that we started talking about at the beginning of this interview, called From the Ashes of Angels, was published in Turkey 2002. The unfortunate thing is that obviously I was a lot younger when I wrote that book, so I was a lot more rebellious. And not only did I talk about Kurdistan and the history, the culture of the Kurdish people in there, but I dedicated the book to them, which was arguably a great mistake as I look back in retrospect, even though it was a very honourable and noble thing and the right thing. It was,
but it was probably a crime in Turkey doing that.
Well, I mean, the trouble is that it's now meant that there's a good chance I'll be arrested if I go back to Turkey. The book is now banned. Every copy was destroyed in Turkey, and it's no longer available there. And I'm also banned from Göbekli Tepe.
Oh, that's terrible.
Because of the book Göbekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods, being a bestseller in Turkey.
What? You're banned because it's a bestseller, or you're banned because you don't mention very much about the Kurds?
Because it upset the archaeologists who refer to my work as lies and pseudoscience. And the last time I was there with a group of people, which was in 2018, I'm going to say now, maybe 19, we were essentially thrown out of Göbekli Tepe for no reason whatsoever. And if we'd have protested, I would have been arrested and thrown into jail. The military police were ready for anything to kick off. And I mean, I had no advanced knowledge of this at all. I'd even told the guy in charge of the place, Dr. Lee Clare, that I was on the way. So I had no understanding of what was about to hit me. And, we were screamed at by Dr. Lee Clare. We don't want your lies and pseudoscience here. So that's what we're talking about in this interview now. It's all lies and pseudoscience.
Okay.
But is that what you think? Is that what the viewers think? Maybe, maybe not.
I don't think so. I mean, some of the viewers will, of course, think that, but it doesn't matter because it's a free country, and nobody knows anyway what happened.
Well, I mean,
15,000, 20,000, 100,000 years ago, and
yeah.
I mean, your theories are better than many, but I mean, they're at least as good as any. So, I mean, who can say that you're wrong?
Well, I mean, look, what I say is not lies, and if it's taken as pseudoscience, then that's fine. I don't care really. But I mean, I just think it's a shame that scholars and academics act this way, that they feel so challenged by books that are simply potboilers, if you like. I mean, as far as what they would see to do with a particular subject matter, that they should be so concerned that they should act this way. And I think that only makes them look bad, not me.
I think secretly many are happy that you mavericks do these things, because it's like you're testing theories that they would never dare to test in open.
Well, here's one thing, is that the following day after all this took place at Göbekli Tepe, I mean, some of our group went back to Göbekli Tepe. I said, look, you go. If I go, a riot is going to occur. I said, so you go. So they went there, and one of them was just taking some photographs, and a woman came up to him, German woman, who was an archaeologist, and she said, are you with Andrew Collins's, tour group? And he sort of reluctantly thought, oh my God, what do I say? And he said, yes, I am. Yeah, okay, I am. And she said, well, I just want you to know that not all archaeologists think the way that Dr. Lee Clare thinks, that there are many people here that have read Andrew Collins's book, Göbekli Tepe, Genesis of Gods, and feel that he's got some very valid points, and that, anybody is essentially free to come up with their views to do with the site. We don't agree with all of it necessarily, but some good valid points in there. And that was great to hear that
yes.
This is not some kind of carte blanche belief of everybody who works at Göbekli Tepe, that others, clearly have differing views. So that meant a lot to me.
Yeah, that's exactly how it should be. Andrew Collins, a warm thanks for being a guest on the show, and this has been a fascinating and wonderful conversation and an education, and good luck with your continued work, whether it be in Göbekli Tepe or not, but all these projects that you have ahead of you.
I mean, the only thing obviously I want to add is if people are interested in my work and want to communicate, go on to my website, which is andrewcollins.com. You can email me via that, or obviously I'm on social media, Instagram, Twitter and Facebook. And what else? Yeah, we do tours to Egypt and Turkey, but clearly I can't go on the Turkey one for obvious reasons, although we're trying to sort out that problem, by the way. I mean, I've got a new book coming out with Greg Little next March, but my latest book, most recent one, which came out in 2019 was Denisovan Origins, co-authored with Dr. Greg Little. And that goes into everything that we've talked about, really, I think, including Göbekli Tepe. We just continue to try and solve the mysteries of the universe. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andrew, once again. Good luck. Bye-bye.
Take care.